The Basics of Biblical Greek, Chapter 22. Before we begin Chapter 22, let's review our personal endings and the master verb chart. The personal endings come at, as the name implies, the end of the Greek verb in the indicative mood to state the subject in terms of person and number. There are two sets, primary and secondary. Primary endings are used on unaugmented forms. Secondaries are used on augmented forms. The primaries can be either active or middle passive. The primary actives, nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. The primary middle passives are my, psi, tai, metha, stha, ntai. To the right of each of those in yellow, you see what the form looks like with its connecting vowel. The secondaries, which we just learned last lesson, are used with augmented verb forms. The secondary actives, nu, sigma, nothing, often followed by a movable nu, men, te, and nu. The secondaries, middle passives, main, sa, ta, metha, stha, nta. Again, the right column in white gives you what the form looks like with its connecting vowel. These primary and secondary endings combine with other elements to make the various forms of the Greek indicative verb. So by way of review, the present active is formed by combining the present stem plus a connecting vowel and a primary active personal ending. The present middle passive is a present tense stem, connecting vowel, and the primary middle passive ending. The imperfect active uses an augment, the present stem, connecting vowel, and the secondary active endings. Imperfect middle passive, augment, present stem, connecting vowel, secondary middle passive endings. The future actives use a different stem. The future active stem plus a tense formative, the sigma, connecting vowel, and a primary active ending. If, however, the future stem ends in a liquid, mu, nu, lambda, or rho, the future active stem is used plus epsilon sigma, then connecting vowels, and then the primary active endings. Of course, the sigma drops out, and the epsilon contracts with the connecting vowel to make the forms look like they're epsilon contract verbs. However, it's on the future stem, not the present stem. Future middle is formed with a future active stem, sigma, the connecting vowel, and the primary middle passive endings. And the liquid future is formed similarly, except the tense formative is epsilon sigma. These are the verb forms that we've learned so far. In every case, it's a combination of various elements that make up the verb. So, looking carefully at a verb, its beginning, its middle, its ending are all necessary to properly understand the verbal form. Today we take up the aorist. The aorist is the second of the two ways in which Greek deals with what we in English call the past tense. The imperfect was ongoing action in the past. The aorist is undefined action in the past. In this lesson, we'll look at the existence of two different ways of forming the aorist. Then we'll focus in on the second aorist, active and middle, with some examples. We'll go back to some previous words to see what their tense stems are like. We'll look at a couple of forms that may seem awkward at first but actually aren't, and then spend a bit of time at the end on the nuances of the aorist, a little bit more advanced section. Let's start with the two aorists. The aorist is one of the ways in which Greek conveys the ideas that are behind what we call in English the past tense. But in English, the past tense can be formed in two different ways, depending on the verb. Some verbs form the past tense by adding what amounts to a tense formative, ed, to the end. So the present play has the past tense played. But some English verbs form the past tense by using a different stem. Run becomes ran. There are two ways of forming the past tense in English. Similarly, there are two ways of forming the aorist in Greek. The first aorist uses a tense formative, sigma alpha, to indicate that the form is aorist. The second way of doing so is by employing a different stem, as in ebelon. The stem is not beta alpha lambda lambda, as in the present, but just beta alpha lambda. That's the different stem. Greek words, with only a couple of exceptions, only have either a first aorist or a second aorist. They don't have both. Just like in English, it's either ed or the form changes. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the second aorist formation because it's very similar to the imperfect. The second aorist active. We've added another line to the master verb chart to identify how the second aorist active is formed. It involves an augment using the aorist active stem, connecting vowels omicron, epsilon, and the secondary active endings. The formation, as you see, is quite similar to the imperfect active. The difference is that while the imperfect active uses a present stem, the second aorist uses an aorist stem, an aorist active stem. So those verbs that have second aorists form their aorist this way: augment, aorist active stem, omicron, epsilon, secondary active endings. Take the verb lambano. Its first three principal parts are lambano, lapsomai, that's the future, and elabon, which is the aorist. The aorist stem is the unaugmented lab. So the formation of the aorist is augment plus aorist stem plus connecting vowel plus ending. So elabon means I received. Elabes, you singular, received. Elabe, or elaben, she, he, or it received. Elabamen, we received. Elabate, you plural, received. Elabon, they received. Most second aorists of middle form are actually deponent verbs, so they'll be translated actively. Nevertheless, one needs to recognize the form. The second aorist middle is formed by adding an augment to an aorist active stem along with a connecting vowel and a secondary middle passive ending. As with the second aorist active, the second aorist middle is essentially identical to the imperfect middle passive. The key difference is that the form is built on the aorist stem, not the present stem, and the form is only middle. It is not passive. Ginomai has a second aorist deponent form. The stem is gen, and so augment, stem, connecting vowel, secondary middle passive endings provide the six forms that you see in the right column. Egenamein, I became. Agenu, you singular, became. Agenita, he, she, or it became, or it happened. It's often translated that way. Agenomantha, we became. Agenesthe, you plural, became. Agenonta, they became, or they happened. Having looked at the forms of the second aorist, active and middle, let's practice some translation. Elabamen is clearly built on an aorist stem, lab, from lambano, to receive, so it's translated, we received. Agenita is third person singular, second aorist middle in form, but the verb is deponent. This form is often translated, it happened. Notice the one-letter difference with agenita. Gin is the present stem. Gan is the aorist stem. So if it's built on the present stem, it's imperfect. It was happening. Ebeles, you singular through. Notice bal with one lambda is an aorist stem. Ebeles with two lambdas, the bal with two lambdas is the present stem. So an augment on a present stem is translated as an imperfect. You singular were throwing. Eothete, from erkomai. This verb, the present stem is deponent, but the second aorist stem is not deponent, so it's simply translated you came or went. Heiren is the augmented stem of heurisko, aorist stem, she, he, or it found. As hinted at with the discussion of ealthon, certain tense stems that we had previously in the present, we now need to see what their second aorist form is. Again, some words are first aorists, others take second aorists. The examples we'll look at are second aorists. They, of course, don't have first aorist forms. Listed here in the first column are the first person singular present active indicative of verbs you've already had in the course. Each of these verbs has a second aorist. In the second column, those second aorists are listed. Some of them you can sort of recognize. Gna being the root behind gnosko and egnon, bal being the root behind ekbalo and exebalon. But erkomai has a separate root for its aorist, ealthon. Lego has a separate root for its aorist, apon, and horao has a second root for its aorist, adon. Apon and adon, I said, I see, are often confused because they sound somewhat similarly. The way I remember them is to look at the middle consonant, the delta, turn it on its side, and recognize how it looks sort of like spectacles, so I see. Two other forms, esgon and sinegagon, are also provided, the second aorists of their respective presents. There are two forms that commonly occur, which may cause some confusion at first because of the connecting vowel. The first of those is the second aorist of gnosko, egnon. We're used to on s e, amen et on, but here it's on os o, omen ota osan. Here we have an example of why we learn the personal endings without the connecting vowel. If you ignore the vowel, you can see the endings quite clearly. The one difference is the san used for the third person plural. We ran into that previously with the imperfect of ami, using san, asan. Here that san appears again. Likewise, we've learned oida as I know. Its imperfect is adain. It's actually pluperfect in form. The epsilon iota is quite confusing, but if one ignores the vowel, one can still clearly see the endings. Nu, sigma, nothing, men, te, and then the alternate, san, instead of nu. So, I was knowing, you singular were knowing, he, she, it was knowing, we were knowing, you plural were knowing, they were knowing. Let's try a few more translation examples. Apen is third person singular of the aorist from Lego. She said. Egnote, ignore the omega, notice the te, and it's easy to translate this form as you plural knew. The aorist of ginosko. Sin agagamen is the first person plural of sinago, aorist form. We gathered. Adis is the second person singular of the second aorist from harao, you singular, saw. Pros eilthen is the third person singular from pros erkomai, it's the second aorist in form, he came to or toward something. Elambanon is formed on the present stem, and so it's an imperfect. They were receiving. Could also be, hypothetically, I was receiving. Ace er komatha is a present active deponent. We are entering. When translating the aorist, we often use the simple past. But remember, the aorist is undefined action in the past. And so depending on context, it can carry a number of rather interesting nuances beyond just the simple past. This is an advanced topic, but consider these examples. In the Greek phrase, he came into the regions of, whatever that region might be, this is called a constantive aorist, because someone coming into the regions of an area, that's not just a point action. It involves some ongoing work, but it has been completed. He came into the regions of. What's often called the ingressive aorist is a phrase like orgisthe. She was angered. Well, obviously, if one becomes angered, that anger endures. The event that caused the anger began it, ingressive. The gnomic aorist is used to express a timeless truth. The grass withered, literally, is what the Greek says, but we would translate it, the grass withers. It's sort of a timeless truth, a gnomic. And then there can also be a sense in which the aorist can convey future overtones. Whom he justified, he glorified. Well, of course, the glorification will come at the end time. It's proleptic with future overtones. Again, the more you work with the aorist, the more you'll realize the action is undefined and determined by the context, not by the form. And so a rigid translation with a simple past, a punctiliar translation, doesn't always work. Some of these other ways of conveying the aorist are inferred through the context. In this lesson, we have discovered that there are two different ways of forming the aorist, the undefined action in the past. Just as in English, so in Greek. The formation can be done either by adding something to the verb or changing the stem. In this lesson, we looked at the second aorist, active and middles, because they are quite similar to the imperfect, the only difference being the stem. that's used. We did review some previous words to see their stems, especially when those stems come from different roots. Aothon, apon, and adon are the big three, and since they occur so often in the New Testament, they must be learned. We learned the importance of looking at the personal ending only, not the vowel, in terms of parsing some seemingly different forms. And we also in this lesson talked a bit about how the aorist, being undefined action in the past, can, depending on the context, convey proleptic ideas, constative ideas, gnomic ideas, or ingressive ideas. That's our lesson. Thanks.